Hello and welcome to Magic Boy Productions, where we build and play powerful commander decks and learn along the way. I'm Ben, aka Magic Boy on Magic Online, and today we'll be showcasing an interactive Azorius list that plays at instant speed and tries to answer the question, can you even build a tempo deck in Commander? Or maybe, what the heck even is a tempo deck? This video will consist of a deck overview that will delve into the concept of tempo and how it applies to Commander, along with what's actually in the list, some gameplay where I break down our play and our opponents to see what we can learn, followed by a game review, and then final thoughts on the deck. Be sure to check out the full deck list in the description. If you're a Magic Boy yapping enjoyer, you'll be thrilled to hear that I'll be diving into my personal history with this deck and some Commander format theory before getting into the actual discussion of cards included. I've broken this section into 2 chapters in the description, so feel free to skip ahead if you aren't interested in hearing me talk for a few minutes about translating Magic concepts, particularly tempo, to Commander. This deck is an update of one of my favorite decks from many moons ago when I played Paper Magic. I was a huge fan of the original Tarkir block limited and decided I really wanted to build a deck around Dragonlord Ojutai, and that deck was something of a love letter to the concept of control. I love variety. It's one of the reasons Commander is my favorite format, so I build a lot of styles of decks, but if I was forced to lock into one archetype for the rest of my days, Control is definitely the one I'd pick. Control decks are all about interaction, and interaction is a massive source of discourse in the Commander community. I'll probably do a video devoted to the topic in the future, but briefly, opinions on the subject are all over the map, ranging from play more removal to play no removal, with variations like only play sweepers mixed in. The gist is that with 3 opponents, playing 1-for-1 interaction just doesn't make sense most of the time, and if you subscribe to that theory and want to play Control, it seems like the only way to go is to load up on mass removal, which, along with tons of counterspells, leads to many players disliking playing against the archetype overall. My Dragonlord Ojutai deck was meant to be a control deck that could keep up with an entire table's worth of threats, and it was successful enough that I only broke it out for special occasions when I wanted to feel extra smart and handsome and especially smart. The deck was brimming with efficient instant speed counterspells, removal and card advantage, with commander damage as the win condition. Ojutai's triggered ability would help ensure that I could always find more interaction or card draw. It could generally police the whole table while taking players out one by one. If that sounds tedious, opponents often thought it was, which is why I tended to play this deck in pods that were on board for very sweaty games. So as I was considering what Azorius decks I might want to build for the channel, I remembered Dragonlord Ojutai. Could that deck be updated to be successful in 2025? Honestly, probably not. Threats have outpaced answers for the entire history of Magic, and nowadays that kind of list would really struggle to perform. It ran a lot of cards ranging from mana rocks to card draw spells that had no effect on the board. The options for flash creatures were pretty limited, so the few we played were usually relegated to chump blocking to help Ojutai get across the finish line. That kind of deck just doesn't really work well in this era of Magic, where playing to the board is usually king, and it's easier than ever to get a ton of value from cards even when they're dealt with. Could the deck be adapted for success in 2025 though? As long as we consider the deck Azorius Flash and work from there, the answer is yes, at least according to me in this video. Playing at instant speed was what I loved most about the deck, so that was where I started with this one. It turns out that there have been a ton of white and or blue creatures with Flash printed in the last 10 years, enough to fill out an entire curve with cards that can interact with opponents while also putting pressure on life totals. What began to take shape wasn't really a control deck anymore. It wanted to play a bunch of creatures, which control decks usually don't like doing. Those creatures were usually going to be outclassed by our opponent's creatures, but the card pool included tons of evasion and interaction, and being playable at instant speed meant they had synergy with other instant speed spells, having small evasive threats, playing during our opponent's turns, and having a lot of interaction. That actually sounded a lot like a tempo deck. Interesting. If you're wondering what that means, tempo is a concept that most players develop an intuitive understanding of, but processing and articulating it can be more murky. It encapsulates the relative board positions of each player, and the way that mana efficiency and production and card advantage contribute to those board positions to bring the game to its conclusion. If you ask why someone else is ahead, usually people point to how much mana they have access to or how many cards in hand, or their board presence or all of the above. Understanding tempo is about recognizing the relationship between these things as the game goes on and players begin to interact with one another. When someone is ahead on tempo, they can afford to make plays that are less efficient or card disadvantageous to try to close out the game without truly being punished for it, and different archetypes harness tempo in different ways. Aggro decks capitalize on early tempo by playing cheap resilient threats and spells that convert card advantage directly into damage. Control decks seek to grind their opponent's tempo into oblivion and overwhelm with tempo in the late game. Combo decks look to spike tempo to a game-winning point on a single turn based on unique card interactions. Mid-range decks assert that overall card quality can affect both players' tempo sufficiently to go over some decks and then under others. So doesn't that mean every deck is a tempo deck? Yes, but the decks the community at large refer to as tempo decks have a fairly unique plan that involves playing efficient threats and then expending tempo in specified ways to allow those threats to close out the game. Bounce spells and efficient counterspells spells are hallmarks of how they usually accomplish that, allowing them to trade cards for damage in a way that's more tricky and usually more inconsistent than something like a burn spell. Against aggro decks, they use interaction to race, returning threats to hand and then countering them on the way back down. Against control decks, they disrupt opposing interaction to keep applying pressure. Tempo decks aren't usually very good even in 60 card formats though. They rely on having the right cards at the right time, which is a tall order in a game with as much variance as Magic, and only having temporary answers can be a massive liability. But to get back to the deck, yeah, wow, that still sounds a lot like what we're trying to do here. So a new question emerged. Can we build a tempo deck that can be successful in Commander? We're almost into the actual card discussion, but there's one more overarching point I want to make first. The common consensus is that tempo just isn't a factor in Commander, even though tempo-oriented language is seeped into our collective Magic vocabulary. If you're someone who's never thought much about tempo, but has said, we should go after them, they're really ahead, or, oh man, I'm so far behind, you were probably talking about tempo even if you weren't thinking about it in those terms. If you think of tempo as an advantage bar, when you have 4 players, it's more like an advantage trapezoid or something. I don't know, I'm not a shape scientist. Sometimes multiple players will have a massive tempo advantage, and even when they do, how to convert that into a win isn't always clear the way it would be in a 1v1 game. Add to that how easy it is to generate massive mana and card advantages in Commander, and you can see why a lot of people think tempo just isn't worth thinking about when it comes to multiplayer games. But I think, just like any other overarching concept in Magic, it can be adapted and applied to the format. We have to look at how other archetypes adapt to Commander. Beating down in Commander can definitely happen, but it usually takes the form of going super wide with tokens, or going super tall with fatties and then pumping them, and even includes Voltron strategies. Control decks and combo decks have a little more consistency between single player and multiplayer formats, but they still get warped to accommodate the fact that there are 3 times as many threats to deal with and 3 times as much potential disruption to fight through. Another lens for this is resource accumulation, which is a defining element of Commander as a format. Aggressive decks often tie their resource accumulation to attacking, with cards like Professional Facebreaker or Toski, while control decks use interaction to allow them to accumulate resources without attacking, and combo decks ignore it all in favor of high-risk, high-reward resource spikes. I'd classify most Commander decks as mid-range though, with some layered synergies and soft combos. They can skew more aggressive or more interactive, but they usually leverage card quality to be able to get their synergies online, at which point they snowball in resources and tempo to close out the game. What we usually refer to as going off. If you accept that premise, that's how we have to look at tempo as a concept in the Commander format, and informs how I'll discuss it here. It still tracks with what I said earlier about the relationship between mana and cards and the end of the game, but to extend the music metaphor, rather than looking at every single note of the game like we might in Modern or Standard or Limited, we want to look at the points of crescendo and what leads to them. The key difference here is the number of players. In 1v1, you're always using your tempo against the same person. In Commander, you often have to choose a target, or you have to generate so much tempo that you can take out 3 players at once. This is one of the reasons combos are such a huge part of this format compared to others, and why people tend to have such strong feelings about them. With that in mind, if we want to build a tempo deck in Commander, we're essentially looking to trade our ability to go off for the ability to keep opponents from going off, while still having a way to actually win the game in this no going off environment we're trying to produce. Or actually, because politics is a thing, we're totally fine with people going off as long as they go off on each other. So we really only need to worry about thwarting tempo that's directed our way, or thwarting situations where the amassing of tempo threatens to outstrip our ability to deal with it down the line. That's how I approached building and playing this deck, and we're finally ready to start talking about the actual cards in the list. Usually I begin this section by talking about the commander, but this deck isn't actually built around Urianger. I picked him after I had the rest of the shell in place and identified what it needed from the command zone, so we'll get to him later. Apologies to all thou who didst come here for him. The core of the deck is a curve of creatures that can be played at instant speed that generate some other type of advantage, either when they enter the battlefield or as they sit on it or attack. The vast majority of them are interactive, countering spells, providing permanent or temporary removal, closing off options to our opponents, or protecting us or our board from interference. Most of them are also evasive, which is important to being able to apply pressure as we look to harness the dynamics of tempo in a given commander game. Opposing board states will usually outclass ours in raw power and toughness, but flying means that doesn't matter as long as we can keep them from using that power and toughness against us. I don't think it's worth discussing every one of these cards. They all do similar things overall, and some are situationally better than others. I spoke earlier about needing to have the right cards at the right time, and the overall selection is meant to make that possible, giving us access to ways to interact with everything from permanents to spells to abilities, while also getting around things like uncounterability. There are a few worth mentioning though, to help point out when they're at their best or what else they offer. Salvation Swan is one. We run a few other birds, so we can actually get a little extra mileage out of it, and granting evasion is just as important as saving something from a removal spell, which is why we play it instead of something like Restoration Angel. There are still plenty of targets, and most of them really enjoy getting a flying counter. On the subject of protection and gaining flying, we're also trying out another Spider-Man card that helps protect our board. Spectacular Spider-Man, aka Ademi of the Silk Shoots. Ophelia is extremely flexible, able to remove a key permanent for a little bit or help generate value by blinking our permanents. I actually classify her as a value piece in the deck list because I think that's what she's going to do most of the time, but like a lot of cards in the deck, she can also be disruptive when needed. She also combos with Containment Priests, exiling creatures permanently, and we have very little on our side that Flash Hate Bear shuts down. The other class of cards I want to mention are Smirking Spelljacker, Transcendent Dragon, and to a lesser extent Draining Well. These cards are clunky and you don't see them played often in the format anymore, but in this deck they're almost the pinnacle of what we're looking to do since they scale with our opponent's tempo. The bigger the spell the better, and at most tables someone is going to present a very juicy target that will result in a huge payoff, and because we play entirely at instant speed, we aren't usually punished for keeping the option to cast these spells open. If you've never hit a Consecrated Sphinx with a Transcendent Dragon, it's definitely something I recommend. Our instant speed dynamic is worth a quick aside that goes back to our tempo lesson, so sorry to those who skipped it. If we're on the lookout for these spikes in tempo, we want to be able to act with as much information as possible and only when the spikes in tempo threaten us. Being able to play almost entirely at instant speed lets that happen. We can let a powerful spell resolve and only deal with it when we're sure it will threaten us. We can let one player who's behind on tempo develop a bit so that we can monitor a player who's closer to going off, and then if they don't do anything we need to worry about, we can just do something else before we untap. In that interest, we also play other non-creature instant speed interaction in order to have more efficient or versatile options at our disposal. Flexibility is very important in a format where anything can and will happen. The single target options are pretty familiar to most Commander players, but I do want to highlight a few. Spider Sense or Detect Intrusion, the Through the Omen Paths version, lets us rebuy one of our Enters the Battlefield effects while interacting flexibly and efficiently. Cryptic Command is the height of flexibility, letting us interact with the game's tempo in a number of ways that no other card can really pull off. Sublime Epiphany is similar, and as long as we have something on the board, it's also basically a flash creature. It's actually pretty similar to Spelljacker and Transcendent Dragon in many ways. That segues nicely into Torrential Gear Hulk, which combos extremely well with Epiphany. When it's in the graveyard, we can recast it for free with the Gear Hulk and use it to copy the Gear Hulk to cast another spell. The potential power and flexibility of Gear Hulk is another reason why we included some non-creature options throughout the deck. Snapcaster Mage is all about flexibility, producing any effect that's already present in our graveyard at a reasonable cost. To close out the discussion of our interaction, we have to talk about sweepers. We really can't afford to play ones that clear out our creatures as well, so we have Aetherize and Aether Spouts, Angel of the Dire Hour, and one of our game changers, Cyclonic Rift. Aetherize, Aether Spouts, and Angel function similarly. They're somewhere between a fog and a mass removal spell, and really exemplify what tempo plays in Commander can look like. When someone directs a huge amount of tempo our way, we can say no and set them back significantly, buying time to develop our damage capabilities and find more answers. These are basically a direct translation of the bounce spells that 60 card tempos usually play into a multiplayer format, similar to the concept that you should only play sweepers, not one-for-one removal in Commander. Single target spells that bounce and do nothing else are generally pretty unplayable in Commander, reserved for decks that need to efficiently and flexibly remove permanents for a single turn in order to enact a combo that's being shut down. Cyclonic Rift is probably the best tempo play in the format, since it sets all our opponents back in one shot, essentially resetting the board state while doing almost nothing to affect actual card advantage totals. When I talked about people internalizing understanding of tempo, even if they think overall tempo doesn't matter in Commander, the ubiquity of Cyclonic Rift is a testament to the fact that it really does. Moving on from interaction, we have a number of cards that can generate card advantage, selection, or other value. We want to have as many options as possible, and more cards means more options. Several of them are creatures, but we play a few spells as well to synergize with our recursive elements. Shadow of the Second Sun is worth highlighting. This is another powerhouse in our deck, doing everything we might want, letting us use mana on our turn and still hold it up for opponents' turns and even drawing extra cards. Being a 6 mana spell played at sorcery speed makes it hard to use though. We can easily end up blown out if it gets countered or removed before we can get to our second beginning phase, so we want to pick our window to cast it very carefully. The fact that it eliminates the second main phase and reminder text can also be unintuitive and lead to costly errors, so it's important to plan what we do during our turns once it's online. The options for instant speed ramp are few and far between, but we do play with a little bit of what's available, along with premium mana rocks and Soul Ring and Mox Amber, and another of our game changers, Smothering Tithe. Since we can expect at a minimum to get most of the mana back from Tithe to deploy a spell at instant speed before the turn comes back to us, it works surprisingly well in the archetype, earning one of the few sorcery speed slots in the list. We also have a few finishers, cards that we can use once we've gotten enough advantage to close the game out more quickly. Akroma's Will lets a medium board do a ton of damage and can function as protection as a pinch. Nexus of Fate is a card I usually don't play with, but in this deck, a second turn worth of attacks that we can initiate at instant speed usually helps the game move faster rather than slowing it down. When we can safely resolve Hullbreaker Horror, the game is usually over, though it can take some time for opponents to realize it. I'm personally of the opinion that this card should be a game changer, and a lot of that sentiment is tied to how frustrating it is to play against. But when we're playing a flash deck, it's hard to leave out one of the most powerful cards ever printed with the keyword. This is about as fair as Hullbreaker Horror gets though, and while we can technically generate infinite mana using Soul Ring and Mox Amber, we don't have any way to convert that into a win, and we don't run any ways to tutor for it. We'd also have to do it at sorcery speed, which kinda defeats the primary plan of the deck. It's finally time to talk about the commander. Once I had a solid idea of what this Azorius tempo deck would look like, I wanted, more than anything else, to find something that would help with mana. We want to cast expensive spells, but we need to maintain a density of interactive threats or risk being unable to actually end games, so we really can't afford to play 10 mana rocks. If we want to get ahead on mana from the command zone, the quote-unquote optimal choice in Azorius is Grand Arbiter Augustin IV, but a tempo deck really doesn't want to paint a target on itself. We're not equipped to deal with that kind of aggression. I didn't see any great options. Errant and Giada are probably the most obvious commander for a list like this, and we do have them in the 99, but we don't need to focus on card advantage like that, and a lot of the best flash creatures are 3-drops, so it seemed like an awkward proposition. It took a few more times scrolling through Azorius Legends before I gave Urianger a second look. I thought about bringing him back when Final Fantasy released because he's kind of a hilarious character in the game, but going all in on him seemed very risky, and the ways to do so were all very obvious, so I'd skipped over him on my first few passes after already having dismissed him helming a deck a few months ago. In this list though, he's an inexpensive source of value that can occasionally get us ahead on mana and can often help make sure we hit land drops, which is important in a deck that's hoping to cast 2 6-mana spells in one turn down the line. I assigned him as the commander and architect, and then everything else started to fall into place. In practice, it's best to look at Urianger as a strong scry engine. His first ability lets us tuck away lands or cards that we don't really want at the moment so that we can hopefully draw what we need, and we can use his second ability to play those lands and gain a little life, or to unleash more situational spells that we've squirreled away for a rainy day. The first ability is optional too, so there's very little risk involved as long as we don't go all in on him. If we want a card safely in our hand, we can just draw it. A little bit of card selection, a little bit of mana advantage, a little bit of life, all in an inexpensive package that doesn't conflict with our curve. Since we often want to play our flash 2-drops a little later on so they don't get caught up in early board wipes or tick anyone off for no good reason. Him being cheap also lets us run our final game changer, Fierce Guardianship, and turns on Mox's Opal and Akroma's Will pretty easily. We do play a few cards that help us get more value out of him, but only ones that can affect other creatures as well, effectively giving us access to pseudo-vigilance, what can be quite powerful with our evasive damage. Cards like Freed from the Real and Pemin's Aura would turn Urianger into a lightning rod and wouldn't do much of anything without him, and even just an untap each turn can make his effect on our draws very noticeable. The final element of the deck to talk about is the mana base. We play 40 lands, including MDFCs, and the utility we added is largely interaction to increase the critical mass of answers at our disposal. Manamo, School at Water's Edge, can do some work with our commander, and we have several other legends that can untap. Mistrais Village is important for a deck that's playing 6-mana counterspells. Having one of those countered back for just 1 or 2 mana can be backbreaking. I don't play Temple of the False God often, but hitting the 6 and then 7 mana mark ahead of schedule is extremely valuable for this list. Now that we've covered the deck exhaustively, let's hop into a game and see how it does. Our first opponent is Sithis Harvest's Hand. This Enchantress is the most played Selesnya deck according to EDHREC by a huge margin, and that's for good reason. Having an Enchantress effect that's so affordable in the command zone makes it trivial to snowball card advantage as the game goes on. Straightforward Sithis decks look very similar to one another, with several other Enchantress draw effects and a slew of staple enchantments in the color combination. This is a deck that makes me wish I had Farewell somewhere in the 99, and can be very tough for a deck with a tempo-based game plan like ours. Sithis wins the die roll, leaving us going second. In the third seed is Channel Recurring Guest Tatiova Benthic Druid. This commander is also a problem for us for a lot of the same reasons that Sithis is, primarily its ability to generate massive card and mana advantage just for existing. They'll probably ramp hard, draw tons of cards, play other landfall synergies, and have some rampy payoffs, all with blue interaction to back them up. Hopefully Sithis and Tatiova will end up clashing and absorbing some of each other's massive resource advantages. Going last is Jared, Golgari Lichlord. This commander has some built-in recursion, making him consistent, and generally his plan is to burn out the table with high-powered creatures acquired on the cheap via reanimation. We can expect heavy graveyard synergies and Golgari grinding from the 4th seat, but Jared definitely has a way lower threat profile than our other 2 opponents. Our opening hand kinda sucks. It's got 3 lands, which is an okay start, but Akroma's Will, Sublime Epiphany, and Dream Eater are all cards that we want to see much later in the game. Retreat to Coral Helm can help us dig with Urianger if we draw some more lands though, and coming into this game I was on a 4-game win streak with the deck, so I wanted to do some limit testing and decide to keep. Ordinarily, especially with 2 powerhouse commanders at the table, I'd recommend mulliganing a hand like this to find some guaranteed earlier plays. Sithis kicks things off with the Wooded Foothills, which they crack for a Savannah that they use to deploy Mother of Runes, a card that can be pretty annoying for us as the game goes on. We We add a 7-drop Angel of the Dire Hour to our already clunky hand and play our Hallowed Fountain tapped. If I didn't have Retreat to Coral Helm in hand already, I would have played Marsh Flats and fetched up a Surveil land instead, but the fetch will let us untap Urianger twice with the landfall enchantment. Tatiova just plays a tropical island, and Jared has a tapped Overgrown Tomb. The Sithis player drops a forest and casts their commander. Our Bold Keep is really being punished as we draw Draining Welk, another 6-mana interactive spell. We play our island and cast Urianger, hoping he can help us dig our way out of this mess. Tatiova has a forest and casts Growth Spiral, drawing a card and then using her extra land drop on an island before passing. Jared plays Necroblossom Snarl, revealing a Witch's Cottage, and brings their threat index right on par with our other opponents by casting Hermit Druid. Hopefully they're playing with bracket 3 constraints, but even without a fast combo, this card can supercharge a graveyard-based strategy. At least we know for sure no one else thinks we're the threat. Sithis plays a Plains, which they use to cast Soul Ring, and then they follow up with Guardian Project, drawing and gaining a life from their commander. They chip in for a little damage at Tatiova before passing. Oh hey, it's another 6-drop, and we haven't found another land to use, which means holding on to our fetch hasn't paid off. We play and crack our Marsh Flats, getting a Tundra, then cast Retreat to Coral Helm and pass, hoping our commander will find us some land. Tatiova has a Reliquary Tower, which is a terrifying card in that kind of deck. They cast a Springblue Druid, sacrificing their forest to get a forest and an island before passing. Jared plays Urborg and activates Hermit Druid, and we breathe a sigh of relief when they only mill 4 cards. Souls of the Lost, Kessid Cagebreakers, Crucible of Worlds, and Sakura Tribe Elder, and they reveal a swamp which goes to their hand. They pass after that. Sithis cast Rancor on their commander, drawing from its trigger. They then enchant Sithis with a Nature's Embrace, drawing and gaining again, but the fact that this is Voltron is good news for us. Provided that we can deal with Mother of Runes, we're very good at neutralizing one threat at a time. They head to combat, attacking us with Sithis, which is less than ideal, but it's early enough that it shouldn't be too much of a problem. We're doing something tricky looking with the Retreat and our commander, and Retreat can sometimes be a combo card, so I can see the rationale. On their end step, we activate Urianger and find a Hengegate pathway, which is great news. Drawing Aether Spouts, a reactive 5-drop, is less than ideal, but it could definitely blow out Sithis in the future if needed. We activate Urianger's second ability, allowing us to play the pathway in Mistgate mode and gain 2 life. When it enters, we choose to untap Urianger with the Retreat and then pass. The Tatiova player casts her commander and then drops a Wooded Foothills, drawing and gaining 1. She cracks a fetch for a tap Breeding Pool, triggering Tatiova again. Jared cycles a Baron Moor on their upkeep, which is a little strange, and then plays a Swamp and casts Urg, Spawn of Turg, which will get them steady value and could potentially be worth a lot of Jared damage down the line. Sithis brings a friend to the party, Mesa Enchantress, which triggers Guardian Project. They cast Dryad of the Elysian Grove, drawing off both their enchantresses and gaining 1, and then drawing again from the project when it enters. This means they can start pulling ahead on mana and cards, and the table is in trouble. They play a Plains, then head to combat, swinging Sithis at Tatiova, which we love to see. Sithis gets through for 5 more commander damage, and when they pass to us, we activate Urianger's first ability again, revealing a Demi of the Silk Shoots, aka Spectacular Spider-Man. We opt to exile it in hopes of finding more land. Instead, we draw Enduring Curiosity, which would be a lot better if we had a flyer active. We pass the turn, waiting for more information to act, and discard our Akruma's Will since we're very far away from that being useful. Tatiova plays a Mossborn Hydra, which can get huge, and then plays Flooded Strand, triggering Tatiova for a draw and a life, and Hydra, doubling it up to 2 power. They then cast Sakura Tribe Elder and pass. Urg triggers on Jared's upkeep, surveilling a filth into their graveyard, which means their whole team is unblockable as long as Urborg sticks around. They activate Hermit Druid again, this time getting a much chunkier 15 card hit that I'm not going to put up on screen until something becomes relevant, but they do find another forest, which they play. They grapple with the past, milling 3 lands and returning Shriekmaw, which they previously milled to their hand. They hang on to it rather than invoking and pass the turn with an 8/5 Spawn of Turg on blocking duty. Sithis casts Satyr Enchanter, and this is just getting silly. It triggers Guardian Project upon entry, and they follow up with Spirit Mantle, drawing 3 from triggers and gaining a life. Tatiova cracks her Steve for a basic in response to the triggers, adding some triggers of her own to the mix to make the Hydra 4/4 and draw and gain off their commander. They then crack their Flooded Strand for a Hedge Maze, surveilling Beanstalk Giant into their graveyard before getting the Hydra up to 8/8 and drawing and gaining again. Sithis trigger and the Spirit Mantle finally resolve, making their commander a little bigger and very unblockable. They play a Windswept Heath, cracking it for a forest, and then cast Defense of the Heart. Yikes. They draw 3 more and gain a little life, but if you've never played against Defense of the Heart, it's usually game over if it gets to go off. It seems like they're a Spread the Love sort of Voltron player though, because they go after Jared now, dealing 6 commander damage to the Lich Lord. We activate Urianger and find Cyclonic Rift. If we hadn't missed a land drop, we'd way rather have that card in our hand, but we can't afford to miss another and stow it under the elf before casting our Enduring Curiosity. We draw a Fairy Mastermind, which in the very least will let us get in on some of the rampant card drawing going on, but that means we're missing another land drop. This game is looking awful for us. This deck really wants to hit every land drop it can, but as it stands, our options are pretty limited. Tatiova casts Bonnie Paul Clearcutter, an absolutely amazing Magic the Gathering card. Bonnie creates Bow when it enters, and then she plays yet another fetch land, drawing again and doubling the Hydra's power. We play our Mastermind with the triggers on the stack and draw along with them, finding a Mox Amber. Not quite a land, but better than nothing. She cracks the Catacombs for a Gingerbread Cottage, drawing, bringing the Hydra up to 32/32, and then making a food. She then plays Harrow, sacrificing a forest for a forest and an island, drawing 2 more and making the Hydra incredibly lethal. She heads to combat and attacks Sithis, triggering Bonnie Paul to draw yet again and put a Tangled Islet into play, getting 1 more round of triggers that makes the Mossborn a 256/256. We consider saving Sithis here with our Cyclonic Rift. We're gonna need all the help we can get dealing with Tatiova, but ultimately they're too dangerous to let live, so we pass priority and they get obliterated. The Tatiova player passes with 11 cards in hand. On Jared's upkeep, they surveil a Genesis into their graveyard. This deck is looking pretty old school overall, which I always love to see. They play Witch's Cottage, putting Underrealm Lich on top of their deck, but Tatiova cracks her food for auto pass equity first. They then cast Gaze of Granite for X=3, which doesn't seem like a great play, but obviously we're biased since this completely blows us out while leaving Tatiova largely unbothered. It takes out the Mossborn Hydra, sure, but we already know they have a Shriekmaw in hand, so taking out both of our boards while only dealing with part of Tatiova, who has as much mana and cards as both of us combined, is probably not the best idea. We don't bother activating Urianger since we don't want to exile another key card, then head to our turn, drawing an Archivist of Ogma, which will probably be good for some cards out of Tatiova. We attack Jared with Enduring Curiosity and draw something that might just help us claw our way back into this game depending how Tatiova plays it. One of our game changers, Smothering Tithe. We cast the Tithe, then run out our Mox Amber to avoid having to discard before passing. Tatiova doesn't pay her taxes, so we get a treasure. They cast Rampaging Balos, then a 3 visits, grabbing Rimewood Falls, which gets her first beast, draws her another card, and nets us another treasure. She plays a Prismatic Vista, netting another round of triggers and a 3rd treasure for us. We crack 2 of them in response to cast the Archivist, and when she searches up a basic, we draw Hullbreaker Horror and gain 1 before she gets another beast and does the same, not paying again and netting us another treasure. She casts Soul Ring, then Explore, playing a potentially problematic Mysterized Village and making a 4th beast before drawing again, making us another treasure. Finally, she casts Courser of Krufix, revealing a Mystic Sanctuary on the top of her library. She heads to combat, attacking Jared with Tatiova and us with Bonnie Paul, triggering the Woodcutter to draw their Sanctuary and put a Dryad Arbor into play. We get 2 treasures total after all the triggers resolve, and we see a Farseek on top of her library before both creatures connect. Jared ignores their Genesis trigger on upkeep and doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe. They evoke Shriekmaw to take out Bonnie Paul, and again, we probably would have targeted the Baloth there. This is the point where I decide to start communicating with that player in chat, but before we can, they cast Reclamation Sage. We considered using Draining Whelk, but we're hoping that they'll use it to take out the Courser. Instead, they go after our Smothering Tithe, which is fair, but Tatiova is clearly an overwhelming threat here. With the Whelk window passed, we have to use Sublime Epiphany instead, choosing all modes besides counter target spell. We negate the trigger, copy our Curiosity, bounce a beast, and then draw a very welcome Temple of the False Gods. They pass after that, and I do hit them up in chat, trying to make it clear that I'm acting as if we're allies until Tatiova has been dealt with to some degree. Smothering Tithe is obviously a problem, but I'm pretty sure they need help, and that card is the only thing letting us stand a chance at stopping the Simic Menace. We draw White Plume Adventurer and just pass, since the odds are good we're going to need to cast 2 expensive spells next turn. Tatiova draws and doesn't pay, showing a Case of the Locked Hothouse on top of her library. She casts Eureka Moment, putting a Hinterland Harbor into play, and we make 2 treasures, then she gets another beast and draws another card and gains 2 life between Tatiova and the Courser, which shows us a Rampant Growth on top of her library. She plays Zendikar's Royal, and then Case of the Locked Hothouse, followed by Rejuvenating Springs for another round of triggers that now includes a 2/2 elemental, and we see Greensleeve's Marrow Sorcerer on top. Her next land drop is Alchemist's Refuge, which is a huge problem for us, meaning she can play at flash speed as well, and the turn order isn't in our favor. She gets another round of landfall triggers, bringing us up to 7 treasures total, and reveals another Marrow Sorcerer on top, Multani. She heads to combat, dividing up her forces between us and Jared. We cast Angel of the Dire Hour before blockers, and it resolves, wiping out their attack force, including the Baloth. In her second main, she casts Broken Bond to take out our Smothering Tithe, but we still need that. We ought to use our Torrential Gear Hulk to flash back Sublime Epiphany. Normally we'd copy the Gear Hulk, but since we don't have any other good instance, we copy our Angel instead so we can deal more damage and draw more cards off our Enduring Curiosities. We counter the spell, copy our Angel, bounce Case of the Locked Hothouse to put off it being solved, and draw a Hydroelectric Specimen. Tatiova then casts Greensleeves before passing. Jared ignores their Genesis trigger again and doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe. They cast Nuclear Fallout with X=4, giving everyone 4 rad counters, but more importantly giving creatures -8/-8, which is pretty devastating to see. Once again, they clear out our board while leaving Tatyova with green sleeves, more than twice as much mana than both of us put together, and nearly as many cards. Our curiosity has endured at least, but the 2 vs 1 seems to be going in the wrong direction at the moment. I point out to them that the sweeper hurt us more than Tatyova, and that we really need to get on the same page. Down the line, we're going to match Tatyova for threat level, but it still seems like a play that's agnostic of the politics at the table. Not everyone likes factoring that in though, and it's possible that they have a plan, but in their position I would definitely have been letting us throw ourselves at Tatyova and banking resources. Tatyova didn't really have much in play anyway and can rebuild very easily. We draw Aetherize, which should help us survive, and we remove 2 rad counters after milling 2 lands, Fear of Imposters, and Salvation Swan. We play the lab untapped, paying 3 life, and then recast Urianger. The sweeper does mean we won't have to clear out an attack, so this is likely the only window for us to get him back into play. We pass, and Tatyova doesn't pay for Tithe. She removes all 4 rad counters after milling Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Entish Restoration, Spore Mound, and Cyclonic Rift. Normally we'd be thrilled to see that hit the bin, but we know she has a Mystic Sanctuary at the ready, and it's starting to seem like this game will be over soon. She plays an island, triggering her landfall effects for 2 tokens, then plays Blackblade Reforged and equips it to Greensleeves before swinging at the Jared player. We put our money where our mouth is and cast Dream Eater, surveilling a Solitude to the top, 2 lands and a Venser into our graveyard, and then bouncing the juiced up Marrow Sorcerer to save our opponent, who we're hoping will be an ally. We need help to chew through Tatyova after all, who recast Greensleeves before passing. Jared uses Genesis to rebuy Shriekmaw. They don't pay for the Tithe, then remove 3 rad counters, milling Golgari Grave Troll, oh boy, Altar of Dementia, Nyx Weaver, and Reflecting Pool. They evoke Shriekmaw to take out Greensleeves, and we're hoping our political play has convinced them to fight the good fight. We draw our Solitude, then remove our final 2 rad counters, milling Sink into Stupor and Snapcaster Mage, the latter of which hurts to see since it's the last way in our deck to flash back a Chroma's Will, which is probably our best chance for a surprise attack on Tatyova. We attack Tatyova with Dream Eater, drawing a Mystic Gate. We cast our White Plume Adventurer so we can start getting more mileage out of Urianger, and it can generate some value by grabbing us the initiative again after the uncounterable Cyclonic Rift happens. We venture into the Undercity, grabbing and playing a Plains after our visit to the secret entrance. We activate Urianger, tugging an island underneath him, then pass. Tatyova activates Alchemist Refuge to cast Multani before heading into her turn. On her upkeep, we untap Urianger with White Plume, and for the first time she pays her taxes. She equips the Blackblade Reforged to Multani and swings at us, leaving us no choice but to Aetherize, returning the Rampaging Marrow Sorcerer to her hand. In her second main, she recasts Multani, then Case of the Locked Hothouse, then plays Mystic Sanctuary, rebuying Cyclonic Rift and making an Elemental token. She re-equips the Blade to Multani, making it a 47/47, then solves the case handily on her end step. We activate Urianger in response to the White Plume and Genesis triggers, exiling a Scavenging Grounds before untapping him. They use Genesis to rebuy Shriekmaw again, and it seems like we might finally be making some progress. If we can deal with another round of Tatyova shenanigans after the Cyclonic Rift, things might finally end up at parity. They don't pay for the Smothering Tithe, then evoke Shriekmaw again, taking out Multani. Tatyova activates it from the graveyard when she gets priority, and we realize that they can basically loop Cyclonic Rift. The Tatyova player says she has no intention of doing something like that, and I'm inclined to believe her based on past experience and her overall playstyle. She returns the Sanctuary, a less consequential land, and Multani to her hand, and while we're chatting about Recursive Cycris, we forget to activate Urianger heading into our turn. We still have the initiative, and we have a fair amount of resources at this point, so we go to Forge on our upkeep, buffing our Dream Eater with 2+1/+1 counters. We draw Subtlety, which is a great addition to our hand, then play our Mystic Gate and head to combat, attacking Tatyova with Dream Eater. It connects for 6 and we draw Swords to Plowshares. Between that and Solitude, there's a good chance we can finally get rid of Multani forever. We pass after that, and on Tatyova's upkeep, we activate Urianger, tucking away a Scalding Tarn before he gets untapped by our Adventurer. She's back to tax evasion, so we get a very welcome treasure, and it seems like we're going to get even more as she recasts her commander. She replays Mystic Sanctuary, netting an Elemental and a draw, which nets us a treasure, but unfortunately the Sanctuary put Broken Bond back on top of their library before they drew it. We only have one real counterspell left, our Draining Whelk, and at this point we're able to cast 2 spells a turn with stable mana sources, so we let the Smothering Tithe go. There's no doubt that it changed this game, since we wouldn't have had a chance without Tatyova filling our coffers. Broken Bond also puts a Windswept Heath into play, getting her another round of triggers, and then she plays a Scalding Tarn for even more. She heads to combat, attacking us with a 3/3 and sending 3 2/2s Jared's way. We take the hit, and she takes the initiative, grabbing a basic before passing with Alchemist Refuge and Cyclonic Rift at the ready. We repeat our Urianger business on Jared's upkeep, exiling a Cathar Commando before untapping him, and they ignore their Genesis again. They tap out for a Breach the Multiverse, which we love to see. They mill a ton of cards that I'm not going to bother putting on screen, reanimating our Witch Enchanter, Tatyova's Greensleeves, and their own Souls of the Damned. Witch Enchanter takes out Blackblade Reforge. My pick probably would have been Zendikar's Royal, but they don't know how much interaction we have left, and Blackblade is probably the biggest threat to them, so it's a defensible play. They pass to us, and we run out Subtlety, wanting to get more damage onto the board, which means more cards from Enduring Curiosity. We then activate Urianger, exiling a Soul Ring, and head into our turn. We draw a Drumbellower, which would help us get even more value out of our commanders while keeping our defenses in place. We activate Urianger's second ability, playing the Scavenger Grounds and then casting Soul Ring, gaining 4 life, and unfortunately forgetting about Urianger's discount and losing out on a mana that we tap since we're not interested in casting anything else before combat. We attack with our flyers, and Tatiova makes the play I was expecting, activating Alchemist Refuge to flash in Multani, who has reach. It isn't ideal to give them so much life, but before they can go to blocks, we cast Solitude to exile Yavamaya's avatar. They respond with Pongify so they can send Multani to the graveyard instead, and that doesn't seem worth a counterspell, so we let it go. They activate Multani again, bouncing Mystic Sanctuary another land, and Multani himself, and then they cast Reality Shift targeting Souls of the Dead, which is unblockable thanks to Filth and Urborg. We connect, reclaiming the initiative, and heading to Trap to deal 5 more damage to Tatiova before drawing a Sea of Clouds and consult the star charts. We've whittled her down to 30 life at this point, and so it's starting to feel like we might get somewhere. We do cast Drumbellower, since there's a chance we'll need as many blockers as we can get, and then we pass. On her upkeep, we activate Urianger, tucking away an Aven Mind Sensor, then untap it with White Plume. This is when I learned there isn't actually an opportunity to respond to Drumbellower, meaning that the timing is now a little different to maximize our Arcanum shenanigans. She plays a Rogue's Passage, which is very dangerous, and not because she gets an Elemental and a Tatiova trigger. She follows up with a Forest for more triggers, and then a Summer Bloom, which lets her play Mystic Sanctuary to rebuy Reality Shift and get another set of triggers. Next comes Windswept Heath, then Command Tower, and triggers abound. She passes after that, back up to 11 cards in hand and the ability to play at instant speed. Another upkeep, another Urianger activation. We find Shadow of the Second Sun, which is one of the most powerful cards left in our deck at this point, which means we'd rather have it in hand than vulnerably exiled with our commander. We leave it on top, then untap Urianger, and Jared ignores poor Genesis again. They cast the very powerful Greater Good and sacrifice Greensleeves to draw 7, discarding Brawn, Dakmor Salvage, and Deathreap Ritual. They play a Swamp, then finally cast their commander. After drawing so many cards, there's a good chance they might try to steal the game, which is something we have to be wary of while we also battle Tatiova. We think better of it on their end step and decide we're better off drawing Shadow of the Second Sun later, so we cast Consult the Star Charts on kicks so that we can keep up Draining Welk. We see a few interesting options and grab one of the new Through the Omen Path cards, Detect Intrusion, which is an efficient way to deal with Cyclonic Rift if they get greedy and don't cast it uncounterably. We forget to activate Urianger again, which was kind of the whole point of doing that, but oh well. The game was up to 1 hour and 45 minutes at this point, and we're all getting a little tired. On our upkeep, we head to the archive, drawing a Glacial Fortress, and then we draw a Transcendent Dragon for turn. This is one of the other powerful cards left in our deck, and we're glad to see it. After playing Sea of Clouds while we still have 2 opponents, we head to combat, attacking with our flyers, and Tatiova blocks with her face, going down to 24. We draw Abelet Spawn, Tishana's Tidebinder, and Misty Rainforest. Tidebinder might be a great way to ruin Jared's plans, so we're happy to see it. Tatiova decides it's time to make her move and overload Cyclonic Rift, but without activating Mistrise Village. Huzzah! I'm gonna be honest, I probably should have looked up whether or not Transcendent Dragon can overload Cyclonic Rift, but the game was long and I was definitely feeling it, so I decided I'd just find out the practical way. For science! The dragon counters the rift, but sadly we can only fire it off at a single target, so we bounce Zendikar Resurgence so there's nothing important to do there. The Tatiova player lets us know she misunderstood the timing on Mistrise, and then activates her refuge to flash out Multani. We target him with Swords to Plowshares, and she responds with Heroic Intervention. We Web Sling, and Web our Detect Intrusion to counter it, bouncing Subtlety to hand since its trigger could be very valuable now that they know how the village works. She responds with a Harmonious Grove Strider, which is fine, and then with a Rabbit Hybridization, destroying Multani again rather than letting him be exiled and netting themselves a shiny new lizard. The rest of the stack resolves or fizzles, and we activate Urianger, tucking away an Alms Collector that seems pretty subpar at this stage. We discard a Misty Rainforest, and I realize I probably should have activated Scavenger Grounds while I had the chance to get rid of Multani for good. Oops. On their upkeep, Urianger hides away an island before untapping. Tatiana starts things off with an Urban Evolution since she clearly hasn't drawn enough cards, and then activates Rogue Passage, targeting their gigantic dinosaur. She swings all of her tokens at the dino at us, which means it's time for Aether Spouts, which means actually not using Scavenger Grounds was brilliant. Fun fact, my recording software stops after 2 hours, which happened right about here. Tatiova puts the Grove Strider on top of their library and then all of the tokens on the bottom. She recasts Zendikar's Royal in her second main phase, then plays Oboros, Palace in the Clouds for some landfall triggers. We activate Urianger on end step, exiling and observe Stasis. We activate Urianger again on upkeep, finally getting the hang of the timing needed for Drumbellower, and exile an Iganjo, Seat of the Empire. Genesis gets to return Mortivore to their hand, which is extremely lethal when sacrificed to Jared, but they don't have the mana for that on board. They play a Prismatic Vista and reveal that they have a lower cost alternative in Night Howler. We decide to take a risk and pass priority rather rather than using subtlety, since we know that Tatiova has a reality shift from earlier. The real risk is that she's tired enough to just let the game end, but she exiles Jared in response, buying us a reprieve. Jared gets a second manifest, then casts Undergrowth Recon. Jared decides that they've had enough though, and decides to go out on their own terms, sacrificing the 45/45 Night Howler to greater good with only 29 cards left in their library. We should have activated Urianger in response, so when the turn passes to us, we've missed out on yet another activation. On the upkeep, we head to the Throne of the Dead 3, the ultimate dungeon trigger. And we see 3 2-drops. Malcolm is the best of them, so we get a 5/4 hexproof burb before drawing a Nimbus Maze, which we play before swinging in with our flyers. Tatiova lets them through, dropping down to 13, and we draw Containment Priest, Guardian of Faith, and Stunt Double. On our end step, they activate the Refuge and Mysterized Village to recast their Grove Strider uncounterably, only we have Subtlety, which doesn't technically counter, and with the trigger on the stack they concede, meaning we win the game. Good game to my opponents as always. This is the longest game featured on the channel so far, and that isn't surprising given the deck's interactive plan. This deck ended up undefeated in the 5 games I played with it, but 2 of those wins, including this one, have an asterisk, and both of those asterisks involve the Tatiova player. You might have noticed that I use she/her pronouns for her, and that's because we ended up chatting a bit after running into each other a few times, and I found out what she preferred. In the first game we played with her, she was on Zul'Adok in a pod that had a group hug deck and ended up way ahead of everyone else. Thanks to Echoes of Eternity, she had 2 Darksteel Monoliths in play, which Magic Online apparently really didn't like and kept crashing, so she scooped to save the rest of us from dealing with that. There's a good chance she would have won that game otherwise, though we did have a Cyclonic Rift to deploy and a ton of answers and mana thanks to the group hug, so it wasn't a lost cause. I think she probably should have won this game as well. The Mysterized Village misunderstanding contributed, but she also could have paid for Smothering Tithe while doing a little less, but still doing way more than we and Jared could hope to. Given the style of decks I've seen from her, that doesn't really seem like how she approaches the format, opting to go full tilt and let others do the same, then see who comes out on top. So we got to claw our way back into relevance in the game, and probably would have won in earnest from the point of concession thanks to Hullbreaker Horror. As far as Tatiova decks we've seen on the channel, I do want to shout this one out. I like the focus on translating lands into power and toughness in a few different ways. It felt less landfall soupy than these decks usually do, and really aligned with the pilot's proactive style. We didn't get to see much of Sithis, but I get the feeling they have a very similar philosophy. Sithis is pretty busted, and I do like the slight wrinkle of a Voltron approach over the usual Enchantress plan, but that's what makes these decks so terrifying. It's still just Eidolon Blossoms all the way down. I'm guessing they didn't quite understand the threat that Mossborn Hydra usually poses, because I can't imagine they didn't have any interaction with all the cards they saw, and they definitely paid the price for it. Jared's deck had a very old school feel, and I think they did a good job overall of navigating their way to their best chance of winning. The game went on for a very long time, so I don't fault them for bowing out. I do think that they probably had a better shot of sneaking in a win by working with us a little more throughout the game, focusing on the inevitable turn where we tried to finish off Tatiova or vice versa, which was the best possible window they could hope for to go off. Saving them from lethal like we did, even after they'd done a lot of damage to us and very little damage to Tatiova, was something of a risk, but actions really do speak louder than words, and we were in a position where we needed risks to pay off to have a chance. Keeping the hand that I kept was definitely not optimal, but I was interested in seeing how the deck could manage with a subpar start. I wasn't expecting to be punished so heavily, but we do play a lot of expensive spells, so that's always a possibility. It was a good game to showcase a lot of the elements of the deck though, especially how Urianger can be solid value for a very low investment. Even without a bad early game, this pod was pretty much the worst case scenario for our deck. We had 2 opponents with the ability to generate massive card and mana advantages, which our Commander Tempo game plan has a really hard time dealing with. If players can always just replay everything we bounce and always have cards to replace what we remove, we're eventually going to run out of answers and get overwhelmed. If you've played any amount of Commander, you'll probably recognize that games like this happen all the time. For that reason, I don't think this strategy is for everyone. You have to be okay with losing, and winning will usually require a strong grasp of both Magic mechanics and the format in general. That might sound like big brain gatekeeping, but I think it would be frustrating to both the pilot and the table for someone to be throwing around a lot of soft interaction without an understanding of how to translate that into a satisfying conclusion to games. Going back to lots of mana and cards being this deck's weakness, politics can definitely help, and there were some key moments on that front that contributed to our victory. We could have tried to make an ally of Sithis, but we let Tatiova take them out instead. If they hadn't played Defense of the Heart, we might have saved them so they could keep fighting against one another, but there was a very real chance that Sithis would have become completely inevitable if they made it to their next upkeep and got to tutor 2 creatures directly into play. When it became apparent that Jared wasn't really considering the 3-player dynamic, we reached out to try to work with them against the obvious threat, and when they didn't help, we outright saved them, both because it was the right play for us and to convince them that we meant what we'd been saying. The card of the game for us was definitely Smothering Tithe. It was the only reason this was a game at all, and I think it's worth talking about when we protected it and when we finally chose to let it go. We had to expend significant resources to keep it around, but doing so was critical to finally being able to get some pressure on the table and open up our more powerful avenues of interaction. Once it had done that though, it wasn't worth fighting over anymore. When you've committed a lot of resources to defending something, it can sometimes be easy to tunnel vision or succumb to sunk cost fallacy, but it's important to recognize that you and your opponents have traded resources, and so as long as you've gotten the value you need, it's better to just move on. Overall, I had a blast playing this deck, and if you enjoy an interactive game plan that's swimming upstream when it comes to typical commander decks, you should definitely think about a list of this style. A lot of players really dislike being interacted with though, and while I think that recognizing interaction is an important, even fun part of the game, as part of most Magic players' journeys, it's worth keeping other players' feelings in mind when you sit down with a deck packed with counterspells and removal. It's also worth keeping in mind that it tends to produce longer games on average, so if you're playing several games in one night, definitely don't pick this deck for that one last game. I think there's plenty of room to flex cards in and out of the list based on your preferences and what you expect to see, but the overall architecture of the deck seemed very sound. There are plenty of great flash creatures that didn't make the cut for me, but that you might like better, but you really want to maintain a critical mass of creatures that can interact for this deck to do what it wants to do. I'd also caution, especially after the game in this video, against assuming the curve needs to come down too much. I'm all in favor of playing low curve decks, and it seems like low-hanging fruit to trade out Draining Welk for something like Aven Interrupter, but in order to translate the tempo game plan into the format, we need enough cards that can produce big tempo swings. And the reality is, the cards that both stop a problem and produce a reasonable clock tend to be pretty expensive. There are also two cards I wish were in the list, but aren't on Magic Online that I definitely recommend including if you play elsewhere. Windshaper Planetar and Portal Manipulator. These cards are on the situational side, but as far as tempo goes, their ceiling overshadows anything else we can do in some games. The only glaring underperformer for me is Alms Collector. It's just a little too expensive, and there are too many sources of card advantage that don't trigger it. If it had evasion, it might still be worth it, but on the ground it just doesn't pull its weight. Other cards that I'd consider easy flex slots are Misleading Signpost, Samwise the Stout-Hearted, and Flash Thompson. You definitely want to keep their replacements in the 2 to 3 mana range, but what they do isn't key to the deck's plan, so they can be shuffled out. Looking at what the deck might need, I think the Tadiova deck outlines some additional vulnerabilities, namely to graveyard recursion and powerful utility lands, especially when combined. We have some answers to both, but squeezing in a few more would make it more likely we can stop those types of engines. Fitting them into the mana base in the form of Wasteland and Abstergo Entertainment would help, and I'm interested in Stonecloaker, which has some flexibility as a base of graveyard hate that can rebuy some of the deck's enter the battlefield effects. I wouldn't hate putting in Ghost Vacuum either. It might seem a little unintuitive since the activation is expensive in sorcery speed, but having a card that can interact with graveyards and sometimes acts as a pseudo finisher could be well worth a slot. That's going to do it for this video. I'm really interested to hear whether or not people enjoyed having some more Commander theory alongside the gameplay, so let me know in the comments or feel free to chime in on the discussion. I'm hoping to work on more theory videos now that I can consistently produce a gameplay video and rapid fire deck tech each week, so comment what sort of topics you'd be interested in hearing me cover. The two ideas that I'm working on at present are some tips for building stronger decks and a discussion of removal in Commander. I also want to do a video about what it's like to use Magic Online to play the format. Thanks as always for watching, and if you made it this far, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to help the channel grow. Good luck and have fun in your future endeavors. Magic Boy out.